A will rewritten, a name vanished, and only Holmes suspects why. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Aravela. Tell me in the comments where in the world are you listening from tonight. I love reading every single one. Let's dive into the mystery. It was upon one of those miserable sodden March mornings, when the London air turned to damp wool, and even the cab horses looked ashamed of their profession, that I found myself once again at Baker Street, the hearth warm, the coals crackling, and Sherlock Holmes hunched like a vulture over his correspondence. The fog outside pressed against the window panes with stubborn persistence, rendering the gaslight necessary even at 10 in the forenoon. I had arrived earlier than intended, having cut short my rounds at the clinic due to a cancelled appointment, and found Holmes precisely where I suspected he would be, clad in his old dressing gown, pipe in mouth, and surrounded by what I could only call a battlefield of monographs, newspaper clippings, and unopened telegrams. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me without so much as glancing up. "How singularly punctual of you, despite no summons." "I was passing nearby," I said, removing my gloves. "You looked so absorbed I nearly turned back." "My dear fellow, you've mud on your left cuff, unusual for you, which tells me you must have crossed Grosvenor Square, rather than taken the longer route along Davy Street. And judging by the particular shade of ochre, I should say it was a hasty change of plan." "I did cut through the square," I admitted, chuckling, "but only to avoid the worst of the wind." Holmes let out a short, dry laugh. "Even your minor deviations are revealing, Watson. I envy your honesty of gaze." He returned his gaze to a cream-colored envelope which he now held by the corner. "This arrived scarcely 10 minutes ago. Observe the trembling hand, the irregular spacing of the address, and the faint smear just below the seal. Someone either deeply distressed or unused to correspondence." "Who is it from?" I asked, now intrigued. Holmes tore the envelope with a neat flick and read silently for a moment, his brows drawing close together like stage curtains gathering before a final act. "A solicitor by the name of Gideon Pirbright. The firm is well established, Pirbright and Mallow, based in Lincoln's Inn. It appears he has urgent need of a discreet but incisive investigation into what he calls a matter of utmost familial delicacy. He writes that he shall call upon us within the hour. A legal matter, then. It concerns a last will and testament, or rather the amendment of one, and the disappearance of a particular name struck out and replaced. Yet no hand admits to altering the parchment. Curious, eh?" "A forgery?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head slowly. "Too early for that conclusion. A forgery requires intent and opportunity. But Mr. Pirbright speaks as though the ink itself rebelled of its own volition. No, Watson, there is something more subtle at work here." We had little time for further speculation, for scarcely half an hour later, our expected visitor arrived. Mr. Pirbright was a man constructed by precision. His frock coat bore the faint sheen of careful brushing. His umbrella was neither damp nor dry, a condition I have only seen mastered by those who carry one as ornament, not necessity, and his pince-nez sat upon his nose like a tribunal judge inspecting a weak witness. His voice was calm but taut, as though coiled by weeks of suppressed tension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am grateful for your time. The matter is delicate, as I express." Holmes gestured to the armchair with a long, pale hand. "Please, Mr. Pirbright, begin from the beginning. Leave nothing vague if you can help it. Precision is our friend." The solicitor nodded and settled into the seat, like a man stepping into a confessional. "You are familiar, perhaps, with the late Lady Eugenia Marchmont?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "The name is known to me, widow of the railway magnate. Reclusive in recent years. Died 2 weeks ago at her residence in Kent." "Precisely," said Pirbright. "Her will was amended 3 months before her passing. It was witnessed, signed, sealed, all proper. It originally named 3 beneficiaries: her nephew Mr. Cecil Marchmont, her companion Miss Ida Bell, and a small bequest to a charity in Maidstone. The new codicil introduced a 4th name, one Mr. Henry Westerly." Holmes tilted his head. A sudden addition. Yes, Lady Marchmont claimed it was a moral obligation from her youth. She was vague, but resolute. I advised her to explain the reason in a letter, but she refused. She signed. We witnessed, and it was sealed. I placed it in the fireproof vault myself. And now? Holmes asked. The name is gone, Pirbright said simply. The codicil remains intact in every respect but one. Where the name Henry Westerly should appear, there is only blank parchment. The ink has vanished. Neatly, surgically, without trace or smudge. It's as though it were never written at all. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And yet no one had access to the vault. Only myself and my junior partner. And we both swear we never touched it. After the day of sealing. It was retrieved last Friday for probate proceedings and well, are there other copies? No. Lady Marchmont refused duplication. She detested anything mechanical. And what of this Mr. Westerly? Is he missing? Dead. That, Pirbright said gravely, is part of the puzzle. I've searched. No record of his residence, birth, employment. The man has vanished more thoroughly than his name from that will. And yet there's one detail I did not include in my letter. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Yes. When Lady Marchmont died, her maid reported that the bell in her bedroom rang once in the middle of the night. No one entered or exited the room, and the door was locked from within. In the morning, Lady Marchmont was dead, of natural causes, or so the doctor says. Holmes was silent for a moment, then turned to me. Watson, if I ever decide to write my memoirs, I shall title this chapter, The Name That Died with the Will. He turned back to Pirbright, his grey eyes alight. We'll take the case. Mr. Pirbright's departure left a discernible tension in the air of Baker Street, like the dying echo of a curious chord. Holmes had not spoken since the solicitor closed the door behind him. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the mist-choked street below, with that distant expression I had come to recognize. It was the look of a man whose mind was already far from the parlor, moving across hidden corridors, constructing invisible connections. He held his pipe between his fingers, forgotten, unlit. I took it upon myself to stir the fire, and pour us both a measure of tea. The silence stretched long enough for me to think he had lost the thread of the morning entirely, until he spoke, soft as a man speaking into fog. Vanishing ink, Watson, or the appearance thereof. I looked up from the tray. You suspect some chemical tampering. Holmes turned and took the teacup from me with a nod of thanks. No, I suspect something far more mundane, and thus far more interesting. There is no such thing as ink that disappears without trace, not on parchment sealed and stored under lock, not unless it was never truly there to begin with. What? But Pirbright swore he witnessed Lady Marchmont sign the codicil with the name written in place. And lawyers, Watson, though esteemed, are not immune to deception, particularly when that deception is deliberate and artfully executed. I sipped my tea slowly, already attuned to his rhythm. So the ink was manipulated. Either it was a trick of chemistry, or the document was switched. Or, Holmes interrupted, the entire business was fabricated from the first stroke. Consider, Watson, a mysterious man, inserted late into a will, a name now vanished, and no record of the man ever existing. This is not merely fraud, it is theatre. You believe Lady Marchmont invented Henry Westerly? Holmes's smile was faint. I believe someone did. And the purpose of such an invention is never without a beneficiary. But surely the solicitor is a pawn, Holmes said flatly, pacing now. Or possibly a player, though I find the former more likely. The interesting element lies not with Pirbright, but with the supposed intruder into the Marchmont estate. This Henry Westerly is a ghost, and when a ghost receives an inheritance, one must ask, who stood to lose? I set my cup down. Cecil Marchmont. Holmes gave an approving nod. Yes. The heir apparent, now potentially supplanted. And yet no protest from him, no scandal, no legal contest. Curious, is it not? Perhaps he doesn't know. Or perhaps he knows too much, Holmes replied, eyes narrowing. A rap at the door broke our thread. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual air of reluctant curiosity, bearing a card upon a silver salver. "For you, Mr. Holmes," said he would wait. "But he's awful quiet about who he is. Seemed well-dressed, but pale." Holmes took the card and read it. Then, without a word, he passed it to me. "Mr. Cecil Marchmont." "Well," I said, startled, "that's timely." Holmes merely smiled. "Show him up, if you please, Mrs. Hudson." Moments later, the man entered. A tall, angular figure with silver blonde hair slicked neatly back from a high forehead. His manner was restrained, almost cold, though not impolite. He bore the pallor of a man whose blood had been left behind at a funeral he hadn't finished mourning. His eyes, startlingly pale, met Holmes's with something between distaste and desperation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He spoke softly. "Precisely. I will be brief. I understand Mr. Pirbright consulted you regarding my aunt's will." Holmes gestured toward the armchair. Pirbright had only just vacated. "Please, Mr. Marchmont, what can we do for you?" Cecil sat, crossing his legs with practiced elegance. "I've come not to protest, but to inquire. Mr. Pirbright is a trustworthy man, but he is also imaginative. I fear he may be drawing the wrong conclusions from a simple clerical matter. I have no quarrel with my aunt's decisions, but I would ask, if there is to be an investigation, that it be conducted with minimal disruption to the household." "The household at Kent?" "Yes, Marchmont House. I've instructed the staff to resume normal routine. There is enough unease in the village without drawing more attention." Holmes folded his hands. "You believe no crime has occurred?" "I believe," Marchmont said coolly, "that wills are prone to revision and forgetfulness. My aunt was of sound mind, but increasingly mystical. She spoke often of debts owed to old spirits. Frankly, I suspect this Henry Westerly may have been some half-remembered fancy. She once claimed she saw her late husband in the garden." Watson glanced at me sharply. "Are you implying senility?" "I'm implying a woman of eccentric imagination. My concern is not over who receives what. My concern is over my family name being entangled in scandal, and I wish to preempt it." Holmes regarded the man silently for a few moments. "You are most generous, Mr. Marchmont. Most heirs would be distressed to find their portion threatened by an unknown figure." Cecil inclined his head. "If the man existed, I would honor her wishes, but he doesn't, and I believe you will find that truth for yourself." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, did your aunt ever mention this Henry Westerly to you personally?" "No." "Nor had you heard the name before the codicil?" "I had not. Nor has any member of the household, any—" Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And where were you on the night your aunt died?" A flicker of irritation crossed Marchmont's face, quickly suppressed. "At Marchmont House. I had arrived that morning. She requested my presence due to a chill, and had taken to bed early. I dined with Miss Bell and retired at 10:30. Holmes tilted his head. "Did you hear the bell ring?" "The bell? In her chamber?" Marchmont paused. "No." "Curious," Holmes murmured. "The maid heard it. You did not." The young man rose. "Mr. Holmes, I am cooperating as best I can, but I will not be cross-examined in my aunt's memory. If there is nothing further—" "There is," Holmes said, standing as well. "I shall be visiting Marchmont House tomorrow." Marchmont gave a curt nod. "If you must. But I urge you to be discreet. The villagers are fond of tales, and Miss Bell is in delicate spirits." "I am always discreet," Holmes replied, with a trace of mischief, though rarely silent. When the man had gone, closing the door as quietly as he had arrived, Holmes turned to me. "Well, Watson, our beneficiary has vanished into the ether, and our heir is too composed by half. You think Marchmont is lying?" Holmes turned his eyes to the fire. "I think Marchmont is playing a game. The question is whether he set the board himself, or whether someone else made him the prize." I picked up the solicitor's envelope again, turning it over idly. "You intend to travel to Kent?" "Indeed." We shall leave on the early train. Pack warm clothes and your revolver. The countryside may be charming, but I suspect the company will not." He turned away then, his tall frame silhouetted in the dim light, and I saw again that electric stillness that came upon him before the chase. No movement wasted, no thought unmeasured. Something invisible had shifted in the room, a scent in the air, the stir of a curtain without breeze. The game had begun. The following morning dawned cold and sullen, with slate-gray clouds stretched low over the rooftops, as if the sky itself had not yet decided whether to weep or merely brood. Holmes and I took the early train to Kent in near silence. He had brought no books, no papers, not even the Morning Times, an omission which in Holmes indicated the severity of his mental preoccupation. He spent much of the journey staring absently out the window, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes unblinking as hedgerows and distant spires flickered past. Once or twice I ventured a remark on the bleakness of the countryside or the peculiar stubbornness of the Marchmont affair, but he offered only the most non-committal of nods. It was past 10 o'clock when we arrived at the village of Braeburn-on-Hill, a collection of damp red chimneys and narrow lanes clinging to the ragged hem of a low ridge. The Marchmont estate stood just beyond it, rising above the winter fields like some ancient brooding thought left half expressed. Marchmont House was a grey-stoned manor of considerable size, flanked by yew hedges and low garden walls that leaned slightly from age. A single winding drive led up to it through bare elms that clicked faintly in the wind, and the windows reflected no light. A butler, with the countenance of a weary magistrate, received us in the grand, cold vestibule. He introduced himself as Harker, and led us through the west corridor, without question, as though strange visitors with sharp eyes and soft footfalls were expected in this household like seasons. Miss Ida Bell awaited us in a modest drawing-room, where a small fire burned as if for courtesy rather than warmth. She was a narrow woman, angular and pale, with the habitual posture of one used to listening more than speaking. Her clothing was severe, but impeccably maintained. No ruffle out of place, no thread frayed. She greeted Holmes with a composed nod and acknowledged me with the faintest smile. "I assume you have come about the will," she said, folding her hands in her lap. Holmes sat down opposite her, with the grace of a cat approaching an uncertain ledge. "Yes, Miss Bell. You were Lady Marchmont's companion in her final years. For 6 years, nearly to the day, I managed her correspondence, her appointments, and her reading. She preferred not to entertain, especially in the last year. You were here on the night she died." "I was. Mr. Marchmont and I dined in the library. Lady Marchmont had refused supper, saying her stomach rebelled against everything but tea. She asked not to be disturbed. Who last saw her alive?" "I did. I brought her tea at 8:30. She dismissed me soon after. She seemed not unwell, but distracted. She kept asking about the date." Holmes cocked his head slightly. "The date? Yes." She repeated it several times. "Is it truly the 21st?" she said. "Is it today or tomorrow that he comes?" I asked whom she meant, but she only smiled, and then I left her room. I did not see her again. She was found the next morning by her maid Alice. Was the door locked? It always was, from the inside. She did not like to be disturbed in the night. Holmes's eyes flicked to the fire, then back to Miss Bell. "Did you hear the bell ring during the night?" There was the briefest pause. "No, but I sleep with a tonic. I'm a light sleeper. Otherwise." "She rang once?" "Yes," she said. "At least, that is what Alice claims." Watson, who had been scribbling notes in his small black leather book, glanced at Holmes, and no one else in the household heard it. "The servants sleep in the east wing. Lady Marchmont's room is on the west side, quite separated." Holmes nodded. "And you never heard her mention the name Henry Westerly?" "No, never. And yet she added him to her will." Miss Bell's lips tightened. She was fond of puzzles, but I cannot say more. It would be wrong to speculate. Holmes stood then, as if their brief dialogue had satisfied him. "Thank you, Miss Bell. I believe I shall have a look at Lady Marchmont's chambers. She rose as well and turned to the butler, who had stood impassive as a clock in the background. Harker, show Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson to the west wing. The servant inclined his head and turned, leading us down a side corridor dimly lit by high mullioned windows. The walls here bore neither portrait nor decoration, and our footsteps echoed faintly in the hush. The house had the strange silence of places recently unoccupied, thick, not quite empty, as though listening. Lady Marchmont's chambers were spacious and elegant, but not ostentatious. The scent of dried lavender lingered faintly. A small book lay open on the writing desk, a volume of poetry by Christina Rossetti, its pages folded back at the poem titled Remember. The bed was neatly made, save for the pillow where the indent of a head remained visible beneath its lace cover. Holmes moved quietly, methodically, without commentary. He examined the bell pull first, a long green cord beside the bed, smooth and unsnapped. No dust here, he muttered. Someone pulled this recently, at least within the last few days. He knelt to inspect the hearth, then turned his attention to the desk. The inkwell was full, the quill had been cleaned. A letter opener lay beside an unopened envelope. Watson, he said without turning, observe the absence. I joined him at the desk. There are no notes, he said. No journal, no personal correspondence, not even a shopping list. A woman of her age and habit would have left something, unless it was removed. By whom? By someone who knew what they were looking for. He stepped to the window and examined the sill. Dust. Undisturbed. The window was not opened. The latch was still secure. She died alone, and yet she ran. Holmes turned to me then, a flicker of something sharp passing across his face. She was trying to summon someone, Watson. Not because she was afraid, but because she recognized something. He paced slowly toward the door. The will, the name, the bell, the absence of paper. They are of a piece, but we lack the hinge. As we stepped into the corridor again, Holmes paused, looking back at the door. She was waiting for something on the 21st. She said as much, and now the name she expected to see, Henry Westerly, is gone. What does that suggest to you? Holmes's voice was quiet. That he did arrive, but no one saw him. Precisely. We made our way down to the parlor again, where Harker offered refreshments that Holmes declined with a raised hand. Instead, he requested a tour of the library, which was granted with stiff courtesy. The Marchmont Library was a long, oak-paneled room, with narrow windows and a peculiar hush to its air. Holmes glanced about briefly before his eyes caught upon a small brass-framed portrait on a side table. Miss Bell, he murmured, tapping the frame. Taken some years ago. She wore her hair differently. You think she's hiding something? I think she knows more than she permits herself to say aloud. As we departed, Holmes paused in the vestibule and turned back to the butler. Harker, has anyone else been to the house since Lady Marchmont's death? Any strangers? The man frowned. No, sir. None but Mr. Pirbright, and a letter, if it please. Holmes turned. A letter? Yes. Addressed to Lady Marchmont. Arrived the day after she passed. I put it in the study. Holmes's eyes flashed. Show me. The letter was plain, its envelope unmarked by anything but a Kentish postmark and a single word, Henry. Holmes held it as if it might burn. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and electric. We are not chasing a forgery, Watson. We are chasing a ghost that knew precisely when to appear, and more disturbingly, when to vanish. And with that, the hunt entered its next phase. Holmes did not speak for some time. After Harker left us alone in the Marchmont study, the letter from Henry resting like a pebble on the dark mahogany desk, he merely stared at it, his gaze fixed not upon the envelope, but just beyond it, as though he were reading the shadow of the ink or the memory of the paper's journey rather than the object itself. I had seen this stillness in him before, an absolute suspension of ordinary thought, a tuning of the mind so precise that even breath seemed to pause for clarity's sake. I, for my part, did what any decent chronicler would do. I observed the details. The envelope bore no return address. Only the single name scrawled in a tight, neat hand across the center. Lady Eugenia Marchmont. The postmark was from Canterbury, posted the day before her death, and yet it had arrived the morning after she passed. The seal was unbroken. Holmes finally extended a hand, delicate fingers lifting the envelope with care. "No scent," he murmured, bringing it briefly to his nose. "No embossment, no monogram, cheap stationery. Watson, you recall what Lady Marchmont said the night before she died? She asked Miss Bell whether it was the 21st, and said, 'Is it today or tomorrow that he comes?'" Holmes tapped the envelope lightly. "He came. And yet, here is the letter. But he came after her death." Holmes glanced sideways at me, a flicker of amusement touching his mouth. "That's what the timeline would have us believe. But timelines, Watson, are often curated." He broke the seal and drew out a single sheet of plain paper, folded once. He read it silently. Then again, he said nothing for nearly half a minute before passing it to me with a soft exhale. "Eugenia, I am keeping my word, though it be decades late. You once said the name meant more to you than the fortune. I hope that is still true. I will be near, though I cannot be seen." Rieg. There was no address, no date, and no signature beyond the initial. The handwriting matched the envelope, small and steady, with a precise slant, masculine, but restrained. "She knew him," I said. "She must have." Holmes nodded. "And yet no one else did. Not the solicitor, not Miss Bell, not Mr. Marchmont. A man known only to the deceased, who sends a letter to arrive just after her death, whose name is struck from a legal document without human hands being seen. Do you think he visited her? I believe she thought he would. Whether he actually did is a separate matter." Holmes returned the letter to its envelope and placed it in his inner coat pocket. Then, with the briskness of a man concluding one thread and pulling at another, he turned back to the desk. "You recall the inkstand?" "Yes." "And how it was full, recently used, yet not a scrap of writing remained on the desk?" "Yes." "The absence again?" "Exactly. And the name Westerly being gone from the will, that is absence with intent. Someone removed him, not merely from paper but from memory. But how could someone alter a will locked in a solicitor's vault?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped to the bookcase and began scanning spines. "The vault is not the only stage. The earlier draft, the one signed, witnessed, may have been tampered with before sealing, or else the sealed copy was replaced. That would require access." Holmes pulled a book halfway from the shelf, hesitated, then pushed it back in. "Yes." And Pirbright swore only he and his partner had access. But people often swear too early, and partners are not always equal in resolve. There was a knock at the door, and Harker entered once again, this time bearing a folded sheet of paper. "Beg pardon, sir. This was found amongst Lady Marchmont's private things, by one of the maids. It's addressed to a Miss Bay. May—" Holmes extended a hand. The butler passed the page over and withdrew. Holmes unfolded it slowly, eyes narrowing as he read. Then he handed it to me. It was a single paragraph in a woman's hand, jagged and uneven. "Ida, if anything should happen to me before the 21st, do not be afraid. I have signed the codicil and placed it with Mr. Pirbright. Do not let Cecil interfere. The name will be enough. He will come. He always kept his word, even when it cost him everything. E." Holmes spoke as I finished reading. "Now we are nearer to a truth, though not yet the truth. She was afraid of Cecil," I said, "or at least wary of his interference. And she believed Henry Westerly's name, just the name, was powerful enough to compel something. A memory, a vow, an action." Holmes turned to the hearth and gazed at the dwindling fire. "And now we know Miss Bell was not entirely truthful when she said she'd never heard the name. Do you intend to confront her?" "Not yet. Let her sit with her silence. It will grow louder." We left the study shortly thereafter, Holmes requesting from Harker a glance at the servants' quarters before we departed the house entirely. The servant led us below stairs, into a long, low-ceilinged hall with stone floors and flickering gas lamps. The air was cooler, but dry. Alice, the maid who had found Lady Marchmont's body, was summoned to speak with us. She was a fair, nervous young woman, with reddened hands and a voice like a sparrow's. Holmes questioned her gently, disarming her with quick compliments on her recall and steadiness. She rang the bell once, sir. I swear it. It was just past midnight. I looked at the clock because I thought she might want a warming pan. Did you go to her? No, sir. I was halfway up the stairs when I stopped. The house was so quiet, and I didn't want to disturb her if it was a mistake. Sometimes the cord sticks, you see. Did anyone else come down? Not that I saw. Had you ever heard her speak of Mr. Westerly? She blinked. No, sir. But there was something odd. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Yes? The night before, I was changing the sheets in her room. She had fallen asleep in the armchair, and I didn't want to wake her, but she was speaking, murmuring in her sleep. What did she say? Alice looked down, hesitant. She said, "You were not meant to disappear, Henry." And then, something about the sea. She said, "The sea cannot keep a promise." That was all. Holmes offered her a warm smile. Thank you, Alice. You've helped more than you know. When we emerged into the chill wind outside Marchmont House, Holmes stood at the base of the stone steps, his coat pulled close and his eyes narrowed toward the trees. He said nothing for some moments. Finally, he turned to me. She knew he was coming, Watson, and the will was her way of leaving a door open. To what? To a memory, to a man erased. But someone else knew. Someone who had reason to ensure that door stayed shut. You think the will was altered before or after she died? Holmes looked toward the sky, where the clouds were beginning to churn like thick smoke. I think, he said slowly, that the name was never meant to remain, and that someone knew just how long it would take a solicitor's conscience to unravel. The question is, who feared Henry Westerly enough to erase him not from life, but from paper? We began the walk back toward Braeburn village, the frost now crunching beneath our boots. Holmes's stride lengthened, his mood taut and sharpened. The fog had not lifted, but I knew from experience that the darker it grew, the more clearly Holmes could see. Behind us, Marchmont House loomed like a thought someone had tried and failed to forget. We returned to Braeburn village in the silver-gray hush of afternoon, our boots still wet from the thin frost that clung to the gravel roads. Holmes remained wordless for much of the walk, his face composed but far from still. Eyes darting, nostrils faintly flaring, the smallest movements of his fingers betraying the machinery working beneath. I had walked beside him on many such occasions when words were too blunt an instrument and silence was more precise. This was not the stillness of uncertainty, but of arrangement of threads slowly drawing together toward a knot. As we neared the edge of the village, Holmes paused outside a post office that looked older than the century, its green door crooked in its frame, and the brass slot worn thin by use. He nodded at it with the barest motion of his chin. "Watson, do you recall the postmark on the envelope from Henry?" "Canterbury," I said. "And yet," Holmes murmured, "if the letter was meant to arrive after Lady Marchmont's death, that would require either perfect timing or a local hand. You suspect it was posted here?" Holmes stepped inside without answering, the bell above the door jangling faintly as we entered. The postmistress, a narrow woman with a voice like dry leaves, looked up from her ledger. Holmes approached with the calm politeness of a gentleman inquiring after stamps, and within 5 minutes had charmed from her a glance at the parcel register and the confirmation that, indeed, a letter addressed to Lady Marchmont had been posted from Braeburn on the evening of the 20th, just before the final collection. "But the envelope bears a Canterbury postmark," I said as we left. Holmes's lips curled faintly. "Which is where the mail was sorted, of course. But the hand that placed the envelope in the box, that hand was here." He fell silent again, until we reached the inn where we had taken rooms. As soon as we entered, he requested writing materials and sequestered himself at the small desk near the window, dashing off a telegram to Mr. Gideon Pirbright in Lincoln's Inn. Request full names and dates of all witnesses to codicil. Include ink type, sealing method, storage timeline. Urgent. The reply would not come before morning, but Holmes had already turned his attention elsewhere. He tapped a finger on the envelope from Henry as it lay on the writing desk. "Watson," he said suddenly, "there is a matter I wish to test. You will accompany me this evening to the Marchmont family plot." I blinked. The cemetery. Precisely. If Henry Westerly is a ghost as we suspect, then perhaps we should look among the dead for signs of the living. We set out just after dusk, the fading light lending the trees a skeletal, watchful air. The cemetery stood on the outskirts of the Marchmont estate, bordered by a low stone wall and flanked by black iron gates that creaked as we entered. I carried a lantern. Holmes bore only his walking stick and a folded paper in his coat. There was no wind, but the air held a curious pressure, as if something were being withheld just above our heads. Holmes led us without hesitation to a far corner of the graveyard, where the oldest stones leaned into one another like secrets exchanged in stone. There he stopped before a headstone, so weathered the name had been nearly erased by time and lichen. Holmes crouched and brushed away a curl of moss, then unfolded the paper he had brought. I leaned in to read. It was a funeral notice, dated 30 years prior. The name Henry Westerly, drowned at sea. Memorial, erected by anonymous patron. He died? I breathed. Holmes tapped the headstone lightly. Or so it would seem, but there's no record of a body, and the name has no legal footprint, since a man drowned and declared lost. A man easily presumed dead, conveniently absent, and then suddenly named in a will. But if he is dead, then someone has used the name for a purpose. A ghost inserted into a legal document is still a weapon. I felt a chill, and not only from the cold. You think someone knew of this grave, used. Holmes stood. The name was never erased from the world, Watson. Only from the page, and only by someone who knew precisely where it still lived. We returned to the inn with little conversation, but my mind worked feverishly through every name, every gesture, every thread Holmes had tugged since the case began. The mystery no longer felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. It felt like something buried in something that had been dug up. Holmes rose early the next morning and was already dressed and waiting when the telegram arrived. He tore it open and read quickly, then handed it to me with a faint, grim smile. Codicil, witnessed by self, junior partner Jonathan Pike. Ink, Parker Quink Blue Black. Sealed with red wax. Firm's embossment. Placed in vault 3 months ago. No entries recorded since. Vault access restricted. G. Pirbright. Holmes looked thoughtful. Jonathan Pike. He could have altered the document. More likely, he never saw it properly. Or he was made to believe he had. Or he added, eyes glinting. He is more than a junior partner. He requested a second telegram be sent to Pirbright. This one briefer. Is Jonathan Pike related to Marchmont family? Confirm background. Then, with scarcely another word, we were on the road again. This time not to Marchmont House, but back to the solicitor's office in London. The offices of Pirbright and Mallow, located in a sober Georgian building near Lincoln's Inn, were precisely what one would expect from a firm with so grave a name. The walls bore no art. The halls smelled faintly of chalk, and the young clerk at the desk looked as though he'd been taught to blink only when spoken to. Pirbright himself received us with the same courtly precision he had displayed before, though his eyes betrayed surprise at our early return. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, surely not more irregularities. Holmes sat, steepling his fingers. Tell me, Mr. Pirbright, your partner, Mr. Pike, is he related to the Marchmont family? Pirbright stiffened slightly. He is Mrs. Marchmont's godson, though I assure you, his position was not granted by nepotism. Holmes smiled thinly. Oh, I do not doubt it. Only tell me, was it Mr. Pike who handled the sealing of the codicil? Pirbright hesitated. Yes, I drew it up, Lady Marchmont signed it, and Mr. Pike sealed and placed it in the vault. Holmes stood slowly. Then I shall be most interested to speak with Mr. Pike. He is out this morning, Pirbright said cautiously. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Then let us hope he returns, for I believe the name that vanished from your vault was removed long before you ever placed it there. He turned to me as we left the office, and his voice was low and steady. We're no longer chasing a ghost, Watson. We're chasing a man who learned to wear one. And with that, I understood Henry Westerly had not been erased by death, but by design, and someone living had pulled the pen across the page to vanish him once again. We had scarcely left the premises of Pirbright and Mallow when Holmes flagged down a hansom cab with the urgency of a man who had already solved the riddle and merely needed to lift the final tile. We climbed in without delay, Holmes snapping out the address to the driver, South Hampstead, number 11, Kettering Lane. And quickly, if you please. As the cab rattled over the cobbles, I leaned forward. What's in South Hampstead? An answer, I suspect, Holmes replied, his tone clipped. One that has been trailing behind us since the name Henry Westerly first floated into the air like a ghost scent. We have been asking the wrong question, Watson. Not who is Henry Westerly, but rather who knows that no one else can prove he is real. You think Jonathan Pike invented the name? No. I think the name was real once, but its utility now lies in the absence of witnesses. A drowned man makes a perfect inheritance smoke screen. No one can contest the bequest. No one can show up to claim it. No one unless he was never truly dead. The cab jolted into a sharp turn, throwing my shoulder against the side of the compartment. Holmes did not seem to notice. His eyes were trained not on the window, but on some distant set of calculations. Only he could see. What is Pike's motive? I asked. He was a junior solicitor. What could he possibly gain from excising a name from a will? Nothing, Holmes said, unless he was promised something by someone else. Someone with a much more personal interest in who did and did not inherit Lady Marchmont's estate. Cecil Marchmont. Holmes's lips twitched. Or Miss Ida Bell. I stared at him. Miss Bell? But she was to receive a portion either way. Holmes tapped his cane against his knee. Yes, a small, respectable portion. But a woman who has cared for an invalid for 6 years, watched as her own prospects withered, and lived in a house that was never hers. Such a woman may begin to feel that she has earned more, especially if she was once closer to Lady Marchmont than we were led to believe. The cab came to a halt on a quiet lane aligned with modest but well-kept townhouses. Holmes stepped out first and scanned the street with the air of a man selecting a thread from a tapestry. We walked to number 11, a brick residence with ivy along the left wall and a name on the brass plate. Holmes rapped sharply. After a moment, the door was opened by a middle-aged maid in a blue apron who regarded us with professional suspicion. Mr. Pike in? Holmes asked smoothly. Who's asking? Sherlock Holmes, and time is asking with me. The maid hesitated, then stepped back to admit us. She led us into a front room, modestly furnished, where Jonathan Pike sat behind a desk, sorting through correspondence. He was younger than I had imagined, perhaps 35, with a high forehead, clean-shaven cheeks, and an expression fixed somewhere between confidence and careful submission. His jacket was perfectly cut, his collar straight, and the manner with which he greeted Holmes bespoke a man used to navigating other men's tempers. Mr. Holmes, he said, rising, I'm told you've asked after me. What service may I offer? Holmes did not sit. He remained standing near the fireplace, cane resting against his leg, the flame of his gaze flickering just behind his eyes. You were present when Lady Marchmont signed the codicil to her will. I was, Pike said evenly. I witnessed the signature and sealed the document at Mr. Pirbright's instruction. And you read it? I glanced at the structure, yes. It is firm policy not to peruse the bequests without cause. Holmes nodded. Then perhaps you did not notice that a man named Henry Westerly was listed as a beneficiary. Pike's eyes barely moved, but his fingers twitched once. I had no occasion to remember the name. The codicil was signed and sealed within 10 minutes. And yet, Holmes said quietly, the name is no longer there. I'm aware, Pike replied. Mr. Pirbright informed me. A very unusual circumstance. Holmes studied him a moment longer, then walked slowly to the window. Tell me, Mr. Pike, did you know Lady Marchmont personally? Only professionally. But you were her godson. That is true, Pike allowed, but I saw her rarely. My mother was her companion before Miss Bell for a time. And your opinion of Miss Bell? Pike gave a slight, non-committal shrug. Quiet. Devoted. Perhaps a touch austere. Holmes turned from the window. And what about Cecil Marchmont? Have you any association with him? None beyond what the will required. I believe I dined at Marchmont House once, many years ago, when I was still a law student. Holmes stepped forward slightly. Forgive my bluntness, Mr. Pike, but if someone had reason to ensure that Henry Westerly's name disappeared from that codicil, someone with access to the vault and the sealing process, would that someone be you? There was a fractional pause. Then Pike smiled. Just barely. No, Mr. Holmes. It would be someone cleverer than me. And braver. Holmes gave no indication of surprise. You admit knowledge of the change. I admit nothing. But I will say this. There are secrets in the Marchmont family which do not belong in court or in newspapers. You're clever enough to sense that already. Holmes was quiet. Then, in a voice low and firm, he said, Who erased Henry Westerly's name? Pike met his gaze. You're asking the wrong question. There was a stillness between them that made even the fire seem to dim. Holmes leaned forward and his voice dropped into an almost conversational register. Then let me ask the right one. Who is Henry Westerly? Pike's reply was barely above a whisper. He was Lady Marchmont's husband. I felt as if all the breath had been pulled from the room. Holmes, however, only nodded slightly, as though he had been waiting for this final stone to fall into place. She had always claimed he died at sea. He did not, or not in the way people think. He disappeared, left her, changed his name. She preserved the fiction of his death to protect her family. And when she was near her end, she tried to restore him to memory, to legitimize what had always been shame. And who else knew? Holmes asked. Pike was quiet for a long moment. Only Miss Bell, and perhaps Cecil. I'm not certain. But Miss Bell found the early correspondence. She pieced it together. She tried to stop the codicil from being signed, but Lady Marchmont insisted. She tried to stop it, Holmes murmured, and when she failed, she made sure the name would vanish again. She told me it was for the family's honor, Pike said, but I think it was for her own. Holmes turned to go, but paused at the door. Tell no one we spoke. Not yet. I believe we are almost at the end. Pike inclined his head without smiling. Do what you must, Mr. Holmes, but be gentle. Some ghosts deserve their rest. Outside, the air had turned crisp and cold again. Holmes strode with purpose down the pavement, his coat snapping faintly behind him. I kept pace beside him, my mind reeling. Her husband, Holmes. She tried to name him again, to bring him back after a lifetime. Yes, Holmes said, and someone erased him again, not with malice, but with the same gentility that marked every cruel thing done in that house. Quiet, polite, permanent. What now? Now we return to Marchmont House. Miss Bell has worn her silence like mourning, but I think she is finally ready to speak. By the time we returned to Marchmont House, the sun had slipped behind a veil of dull cloud, casting the grey stone estate into a sullen shadow. The air held the briny scent of a coming storm, and the bare branches of the garden trees clattered faintly like bones chattering among themselves. Holmes moved with quiet determination through the wrought iron gate, his gaze sweeping over the facade not as if he were seeing it, but as if he were reading it, line by line, brick by brick. The butler Harker opened the door with a faint look of surprise, though he masked it quickly behind his habitual restraint. Miss Bell is in the morning room, he said, before Holmes could even ask. She asked not to be disturbed. Holmes handed him his hat and gloves. Fortunately, Mr. Harker, She may find this is precisely the kind of disturbance she has been preparing for. We found Miss Ida Bell seated by the tall windows, a closed book on her lap, and a thin shawl drawn around her shoulders, though the fire in the hearth was well stoked. She did not rise as we entered, nor did she seem startled. Her expression was composed, tired. Yes, but composed. "I thought it would be you," she said, not looking at us. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then I imagine you know why we've come." She turned her face toward us then, pale in the waning light. "Because ghosts cannot inherit." Holmes stepped nearer, his tone even. "Because a name erased twice is still a name. And you, Miss Bell, are the one who held the pen." There was no flinch, no denial, only the softest tightening around her eyes as she folded her hands in her lap. She was determined, she said, more than I'd ever seen her. She said he had suffered enough, that he had paid with absence, with silence, and that the world owed him restoration, because he was her husband. Holmes said gently. Miss Bell nodded once. They married in secret, long before the railway fortune, before the title. Her father disapproved of him, said he was a man of no station, no stability. He took to the sea after they were driven apart. She believed he died in a storm off Norway, but he didn't. No. Years later she learned the truth. He had assumed another name, taken work in the colonies. He had vanished out of shame, not cowardice. He wrote to her once, and she kept that letter, hid it from everyone. It was the only proof that Henry Westerly had lived. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and stood there silent for a moment. Then, softly, "You found the letter." She met his gaze without blinking. "Yes. A year ago. I was sorting her papers while she was ill. I read it. I knew what it meant. You confronted her. I asked her who he was. She told me everything, that she had never stopped loving him, that she felt the estate was built on a false foundation, and that it was time to lay one true stone before she died. So she wrote the codicil. She insisted upon it. She said she owed him that much." Holmes glanced back at her. "But you believed she owed him nothing." Miss Bell's hands tightened on the edge of her shawl. "He left her. He left her to navigate society's judgment, her father's rage, the humiliation, and then, when she was finally safe and respected, he wanted his name back, his piece of the fortune. You felt he had no right. I felt I had earned it more than he had," she said, her voice rising only slightly. "I stood by her. I gave up my youth to care for her, to run this house, to manage her grief. Grief she never fully explained. And he was a shadow, a memory she nourished in secret. When she told me she was putting his name in the will, I tried to talk her out of it, but she refused." Holmes said, "She said he would come, that even if no one else knew him, he would come, and the name would be enough. And it was," Holmes said quietly. "He sent a letter. He kept his promise. That silenced her." For the first time her breath caught. "He was here?" she asked, the voice trembling. "No. But he posted the letter from Braeburn. It arrived the morning after her death. He meant to claim what little remained of himself." Miss Bell looked down, her face unreadable. "I didn't mean for her to suffer. I thought, once the codicil was sealed, it would lie untouched. But when she died, I knew Pirbright would open it, and that the name would be there. So I came to London before the funeral. I told Jonathan Pike what I'd learnt. I asked for his help." Holmes's voice was low and calm. "And he helped you." He had no love for the Marchmont name. His mother had been cast aside by the family long before. He told me the only way to remove Henry was before probate began. Once it was filed, it would be official. "You had no access to the vault," Holmes said, "but he did." "I don't know how he did it," she said, suddenly tired. "He said not to ask, only that when the will was opened, the name would be gone, and that no one could prove it had ever been there." Holmes stepped forward now, but not in anger, in compassion. "And you, Miss Bell, you would inherit more by keeping Henry Westerly a ghost." She looked away. "It wasn't for the money." "No," Holmes said. It was for the silence. You wanted her to be remembered the way you had helped build her. Strong, alone, untouched by a man who had vanished. There was a long silence. I loved her, she said at last. Not the way people gossip, not foolishly, but I loved her life. I gave mine to it, and I couldn't bear to see her throw it open at the last moment to someone who had once disappeared without a word. Holmes nodded slowly, and there was no triumph in his expression, only understanding. I cannot promise what the law will decide, he said. But I will say this, the man she named has not come to claim his due. He sent a letter. Nothing more, perhaps, in his own way. That was all he needed. She looked up at him, tears standing unshed in her eyes. Will you tell them? That depends on whether the law demands it, Holmes said gently. But I think Lady Marchmont would prefer her final wishes be known, even if unfulfilled. We left her there, seated by the window, still and solitary in the long amber of the dying afternoon. Outside, the wind had risen, pulling at the hedges and nudging the low iron gate. Holmes and I walked in silence toward the village, the road damp and gleaming before us. At last I said, "You pity her." "She was not cruel, Watson," he replied, "only afraid. She saw a ghost returning and mistook it for a thief. And Henry Westerly." Holmes exhaled. Not quite a sigh. A man who chose disappearance once, and perhaps regretted it all his life. His letter was not a claim. It was an apology. We passed the post office, the churchyard, the quiet cottages, with their curled smoke. I knew as I walked beside him that the case was ending, not with a bang of revelation, but with the softer closure of things once lost being half remembered again. And somewhere, in the folds of time and sea, the name Henry Westerly drifted back into history, no longer erased, not fully restored, but no longer denied, just quietly remembered. We returned to London the following morning, the train sliding through fog-wreathed countryside that seemed drained of color. Holmes remained characteristically silent for the first hour of the journey, his gaze fixed beyond the window, where the hills passed like slow-moving shadows. I made no effort to fill the silence. By now I had learned that when Holmes entered these extended periods of quiet, it was not in retreat from the world but in deep conversation with it. His mind, I imagined, was sorting threads, the forgery, the ghost, the godson, the grief. When at last he spoke, it was without preamble. "She nearly succeeded." "In what?" I asked, folding the newspaper I hadn't really been reading. "In ensuring that no one ever knew Lady Marchmont's truth, that Henry Westerly had lived, had loved her, and had returned in the only way he could." I nodded slowly. "But you think Miss Bell was driven more by protection than malice?" Holmes tapped the armrest of his seat. "A curious blend of loyalty and fear. She saw herself as the architect of Lady Marchmont's legacy. 6 years of caretaking, devotion, emotion, tidiness. Then, just before the end, that legacy threatened to reshape itself around the shadow of a man she had never seen but knew was once central. That kind of rearrangement, Watson, can feel like erasure." She responded not as a villain but as a guardian. Flawed, yes, but not cruel. And Jonathan Pike, complicit, but not out of greed. His motivations were shaped by old wounds. His mother had served in that household, remember. Perhaps the act of removing Henry's name was, to him, a small rebalancing, a redress of something buried long ago. I thought of Pike's cool manner, his restraint, the way he had said some ghosts deserve their rest. He was trying to protect her as well. Holmes nodded. Though not in the way she imagined. He kept the removal discreet, reversible if necessary. But once the letter arrived, Henry's letter, it became clear that the man sought not restitution, but recognition. We sat for a while, in companionable quiet. Then I asked, "Do you intend to inform Mr. Pirbright?" "I intend to let the will stand as it is, for now," Holmes replied. "There is no legal challenge forthcoming. Henry Westerly is dead in the eyes of the world, and the letter cannot function as proof of life or claim. But I will tell Pirbright what he must know, that the codicil did originally contain the name and that it was removed through private persuasion before probate. He may decide what to disclose in his own time. The law has its procedures, the truth has its rhythms. I smiled, faintly. That sounds almost philosophical. Holmes arched a brow. It was meant to. We returned to Baker Street just before noon. Mrs. Hudson met us with her usual brisk hospitality and a pot of hot tea, which Holmes took absently. He had already resumed his pacing in front of the fireplace by the time I had removed my coat. It was not until the afternoon that the case's final thread arrived. Not in the form of a telegram or a visitor, but in a letter, a plain envelope, postmarked from Dover, addressed to Sherlock Holmes in a careful masculine hand. No sender's name. He opened it without comment, scanned the contents once, then handed it to me. I read it slowly. Mr. Holmes, I thank you for handling the matter with discretion. I was informed, through means I shall not name, that the will no longer bears my name. That is no less than I expected. My intention was never to inherit, only to be remembered. Eugenia and I made choices in youth that neither of us could undo, but we honored them in our own ways. I will not return. The life I rebuilt must remain undisturbed. I ask only that you allow her memory to rest where she chose to leave it, with respect. Dachidub. I looked up. So he is alive. Holmes gave a single nod, and has no desire to be more than a whisper in her final chapter. He never sought the estate, only the restoration of a bond. However quietly, however posthumously, and you'll honor that? Holmes turned the letter over once more before slipping it into the fire. The flames took it swiftly, curling it into ash. There is nothing the courts would benefit from in that letter, he said, and everything that matters is already complete. I watched the ashes crumble, then drift apart. You know, I said, it's strange how little we ever truly saw of Henry Westerly. Not even a photograph, only words, a name. Holmes gave a faint smile. And yet Watson, that name moved every figure on the board. The heir, the companion, the solicitor, even the dead. That is the power of a name preserved in silence, of a memory never permitted to fade entirely. He turned then, walking to the window, where the early dusk had begun to settle over Baker Street like a hush. The lamps outside were being lit, and their glow flickered against the misted glass. For a long while he stood there. Tell me, Watson, he said at last, when we are gone, what name will remain on our parchment? What part will the world choose to forget, and what will it stubbornly refuse to let vanish? I could not answer him, nor did he seem to require one. The question was not for the living, but for the quiet after. And so we let the case of Henry Westerly close, not with a gavel or a headline, but with the rustle of a letter that burned without witness, leaving only a faint trace in the air, and a place in Holmes's private record, of the cases that mattered more for the human wound at their center than the legal resolution at their end. It was, I think, one of the few cases in which Sherlock Holmes never sought to catch a criminal, but only to catch a truth before it slipped entirely into silence. The following days passed without incident, but not without thought. Holmes remained in the flat, moving through his hours with a peculiar blend of restlessness and withdrawal. He heaned several minor cases, waved off a summons from Scotland Yard regarding a forgery in Paddington, and spent an uncharacteristic amount of time standing by the window smoking, reading through old monographs, then setting them aside unread. There was a peculiar hush to his movements, as though something within him had not yet resolved, though the case of Henry Westerly had, to all outward appearances, concluded. It was not like Holmes to brood over sentiment, and yet there was something in this case that had clung to him, something unspoken. On the fifth day, I returned from an afternoon at the club to find him at the table with a small stack of newspaper clippings spread before him. Most yellowed at the edges, their ink faded with time. He glanced up briefly as I entered. "You'll forgive me," he said dryly, "for returning to the past. It appears the past is not quite done with us." I sat opposite. "What are you looking for?" He tapped one of the clippings. "A report from 1871. A merchant vessel lost off the coast of Bergen, 28 hands missing. One of them listed as a Henry Weston. No body recovered, a mere slip of ink or something more deliberate. I leaned forward. Weston instead of Westerly. He nodded. A slight alteration. Easy to miss. But if you wish to vanish without vanishing entirely, such a change would be enough. Enough to give a loved one hope. Enough to keep the world guessing. Lady Marchmont must have known, I said. She knew, Holmes replied, and she preserved the ambiguity as a kind of contract. She did not seek him publicly, did not name him in society, and he, in turn, remained a shadow. Until that codicil, which tried to write him back into the world, I said. Precisely. But too late. I hesitated. Do you believe he loved her, Holmes? Holmes paused for the briefest moment. I believe he loved what they could not be. That kind of love has a longer half-life than most. There was a soft knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression composed but curious, holding out a small folded envelope. This arrived by hand, Mr. Holmes. No return name, no stamp. Holmes took it with a quiet thank you, and opened it. The paper inside was thin and faintly scented, not perfume but a suggestion of something clean like pressed linen. He read it once, then again. When he passed it to me, I found the handwriting familiar. Mr. Holmes, I do not ask forgiveness, nor do I seek it, but I feel you should know. I returned to the garden that morning after the funeral. The gardener did not see me. I stood by the roses. I brought nothing. I left nothing. I only needed to remember her where she had once been young. I will not write again. Why? I looked up. Holmes's face was still, unreadable. So she went back. I said softly. Yes. He turned and walked to the window. Outside, the streets were stirring to life beneath the clouded light, wheels turning, boots echoing along the pavement. Holmes stood as if watching something far beyond the visible scene. His thoughts not on the carriages or the traffic, but on a quiet woman in a country garden standing alone with memory. I do not believe Miss Bell was evil, I said. Nor do I, Holmes replied. She was merely loyal to the life she believed she had built, and terrified of seeing it rewritten by a name from before her time. She tried to stop the story from changing, and in so doing, Holmes said, she became part of it. We sat in silence after that, neither of us inclined to speak. The fire burned low, and the clink of teacups from the floor below was the only sound for several minutes. At length, Holmes stood. There is an irony to this case, Watson, he said. Oh? It began with a name missing from a will. But what truly mattered was not the document. It was the intention. Lady Marchmont wished to restore someone who had long since ceased to exist in the eyes of the world, and in trying to do so, she forced every living person around her to declare, consciously or not, where they stood in relation to the past. He turned back to the fireplace, where the ashes from the last burned letter had long since settled. Pike chose to erase, he said. Bell chose to conceal. Pirbright chose not to see. Cecil Marchmont chose to ignore. And Westerly. He chose to speak, but only once. And you? I asked. Holmes gave a faint smile. I chose to listen. That night, I sat down to write my own notes on the case. I did not give it one of my usual titles. There was no murder, no stolen jewel, no villain with a monogrammed handkerchief or a blood-stained alibi. Instead, I headed the pages plainly, the case of the stolen name in the will. What followed was less a chronicle of deduction than a meditation on legacy, on the ways we preserve or erase each other, not through law or fact, but through memory and silence. I recorded every detail: the codicil, the sealed vault, the midnight bell, the grave marked by a name that had nearly been lost to tide and time. I wrote down Miss Bell's confession, Pike's admission, the tone in Holmes's voice when he read that final letter from Westerly. I included it all, not for publication, perhaps not even for posterity, but because something in me insisted it must not vanish. When I had finished, I returned to the sitting room to find Holmes seated in his chair, his eyes closed, the violin resting on his lap. He opened one eye as I entered, and gave a brief nod. "You've written it up?" "I have. Truthfully. As truthfully as I can. Some cases are not solved, Holmes, they're only understood." He gave a small, thoughtful sound in the back of his throat. "Well put, Watson." I took my chair beside him. The fire crackled faintly. The rain had begun outside, soft and steady, like the sound of pages being turned one by one. And in that quiet room, with the storm gathering gently around us, I realized that we had not merely solved a mystery, we had borne witness to a love left half-lived, a history half-told. And the quiet ache of what might have been, had one name not gone missing. Some names, it seems, are not meant to be remembered by all, only by the one who whispered them last. It was several weeks before the matter found its final motion, though by that time, the emotional undertow had settled, and the case, as Holmes had framed it, had been filed among those peculiar affairs, where truth weighed more than justice, and memory pressed more heavily than evidence. Yet even then, as London quickened into spring and the March winds stripped the fog from the alleys like a veil being lifted, one more turn awaited us, quiet and deliberate, as if the story had left behind a final envelope, addressed only to time. We were seated at breakfast on a crisp morning in late March, Holmes half buried in the Times, while I nursed a second cup of coffee and skimmed through a letter from my sister-in-law in Yorkshire. The clatter of hooves and wheels on Baker Street rose and fell with the pulse of the hour, and I had just laid my paper aside when the bell rang. Holmes did not look up. "That, Watson, will not be the postman." It was Mrs. Hudson who entered, her face drawn into a line of cautious curiosity. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes, said it's not official business." Holmes raised an eyebrow, folding his paper in half. "Not official, then unofficial, which means either scandal or regret. Show him in." Lestrade entered with his usual clipped gait, but he lacked his normal bluntness. His coat was damp at the shoulders, and he removed his hat as he sat, resting it on one knee as though it carried more weight than mere felt and lining. "Well, Holmes," he said after a pause, "I thought I might ask you something that's not quite police matter, but not quite personal either." "That's my favorite category," Holmes said. "Proceed." Lestrade hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out a document, official-looking, folded and sealed with the pale blue crest of the probate office. "I was at Chancery yesterday. Routine matter. I noticed a case file had been reopened. Marchmont Estate." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Go on." Lestrade leaned forward slightly. "Seems someone has come forward with a challenge, not to the main inheritance, but to the codicil, a solicitor acting on behalf of a beneficiary whose name was allegedly removed from the final document without proper authorization." I sat upright. "Henry Westerly?" Lestrade nodded. "The solicitor's name is Armitage. Works out of Dover. Says he has a signed affidavit and an original copy of the codicil predating the sealed version, complete with the name in question. He's not pressing for funds, just for acknowledgement. An official one." Holmes's voice was quiet. "So Henry Westerly's name is to be written back in?" "If the judge allows it, yes," Lestrade said. "Pirbright is cooperating, but it caught him off guard." "And Miss Bell?" I asked. Lestrade shook his head. "Not named. Neither is Pike. Armitage claims the name was removed under pressure, not malice. The whole tone is careful, respectful. They're not trying to drag anyone through the mud, just trying to restore something." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "So Henry Westerly has spoken again." I saw the corner of Lestrade's mouth twitch. "Or someone is speaking for him. But whoever's behind it, they knew the right channels. Quiet, legal. No scandal. Just re-entry." He rose then, placing the paper on the table beside Holmes's teacup. "I thought you'd want to know." "We do," Holmes said, standing with him. "Thank you, Lestrade." The inspector turned to leave, then paused at the door. "It's a funny thing," he said. "I've seen people fight over inheritances tooth and nail, seen siblings tear each other apart for half an acre of stone and dust. But this This feels different. Like someone just wanted their name written on a story they weren't allowed to finish. He left then, footsteps fading down the stair. Holmes remained by the table, his gaze resting on the folded probate notice. The room was quiet again, save for the distant clatter of wheels and the low hum of the street below. I could feel something shifting around us, not an epilogue exactly, but a coda being written in real time. I poured us both fresh cups of coffee, handing one to Holmes, who accepted it absently. "So," I said, "what does it mean practically?" "That depends," he replied. "If the court allows the codicil to be restored, it means the legal record will reflect Lady Marchmont's intention. Her legacy will include the name she tried to protect. Nothing more. No funds will change hands. No estate will be redrawn. Only the record. And that matters." Holmes looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize only in certain moments, when the world had moved slightly in ways that logic alone could not map. "It matters because stories matter, Watson. Especially the ones we try to suppress." She wanted him remembered. "Now officially he will be." "And Miss Bell?" He sighed softly. "She'll read it, somewhere. Perhaps in a paper, or through a solicitor's note. She'll know she lost her final silence, and perhaps she'll understand it wasn't betrayal, only balance." We sat with our coffee, neither of us speaking for some time. I found my thoughts drifting back to the rose garden, to the bell that rang once in the dark, to the sealed will and the signature that had waited half a lifetime to be seen. Finally, Holmes stood and crossed to the cabinet where he kept his private case records. He opened a drawer, withdrew a slim envelope labeled Westerly, and added a note to the front in his spidery hand. Then, carefully, he slid the envelope back in and closed the drawer. "That," he said, "is the end of it." But even as he spoke, I wondered if somewhere in a quiet house along the coast, a man who once chose disappearance was standing by a window, watching the sea he had once crossed. I wondered if he knew that somewhere in London his name had been returned to paper, that his vanishing had been acknowledged and gently undone. And I wondered if that letter he wrote, simple, humble, final, had been his only word, or merely his first. Holmes resumed his chair, lit his pipe, and opened the morning paper without ceremony. But I saw, in the stillness of his posture and the quiet tension around his eyes, that something had eased. The dead had been heard, the name restored, and the mystery, at last, had exhaled. Outside, Baker Street moved as ever, its rhythms unchanged. But within the walls of 2221B, something quiet and long-shadowed had shifted into light, and Sherlock Holmes, who solved murders and motives and mysteries of the mind, had for once solved something gentler, a missing name, a final echo, a truth written back into silence. The spring sun broke through the clouds on an April morning so unexpectedly clear that even Holmes, who rarely noticed weather unless it obstructed his movements or fogged a trail, paused at the window to observe the pale gold light trembling on the rooftops of Baker Street. I had risen early and returned with the papers under one arm, and the scent of crocuses still clinging faintly to my coat from the flower carts along Marylebone Road. Holmes was already dressed, though not in his usual lounging attire. He had donned the charcoal gray suit reserved for court appearances or quiet occasions of private importance. When I set the Times beside his teacup, he didn't glance at it. His gaze remained trained on the far end of the street, as though awaiting something not yet visible. "She will not come, you know," he said at last, his tone neither disappointed nor expectant. "Miss Bell. She made her final choice when she walked into that garden. Everything after that is silence." They took the chair opposite, and the probate judge ruled yesterday. Holmes tapped the folded paper I had brought. "Codicil restored. Henry Westerly named. No financial alteration. No investigation into its removal. Exactly as he wished." I murmured. Holmes nodded. "As she wished." It had taken months, but the name Lady Marchmont had tried to inscribe into her final legacy now stood where it was meant to, on a line of formal ink among heirs and figures, and legal rights. Not for the world to know the full story, only for the record to carry the truth that had once been erased. No scandal followed. No challenge from Cecil Marchmont. No further correspondence from the man who signed only H.W. The matter, in all legal and public respects, was now closed. But the ripples remained. Holmes opened the paper and scanned the inner pages, pausing at a small notice I had not marked. The Marchmont Trust announced the dedication of a new coastal reading room at the Kent Orphans' Home this month. The room is to be named the Westerly Wing, in honor of an anonymous benefactor long associated with the family's early years. "Quiet," I said. "Very," Holmes replied. He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. There was a certain silence in the flat that day, not empty but settled. It reminded me of those rare moments just after a storm had passed, when even the air seemed to wait before resuming its usual chatter. Holmes lit his pipe, took 2 measured puffs, then turned to me with that slight, unreadable expression that meant he had filed the matter into that private gallery of cases he rarely revisited aloud. "I suppose you'll write this one up, Watson," he said. "I have," I replied, "though I haven't decided whether to publish it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Let it remain unpublished if you like. The public enjoys blood and betrayal. But there is something to be said for an unsolved ache." I leaned back, hands folded across my lap. "There was a moment, Holmes, when we read Henry Westerly's letter, that I thought you might be moved." Holmes's brow rose slightly. "I am frequently moved, Watson, just not always in ways you can detect. Do you regret not speaking to him?" Holmes shook his head. What would I have said? That his name had nearly vanished, and now would not. That his past had been hidden, but was now footnoted in a will and a wing. No, he would not have thanked me for that. He asked to be remembered, not celebrated. I thought for a moment. And Lady Marchmont? Holmes looked toward the fire, though it had burned low to a soft bed of orange coals. She tried to reconcile a lifetime in one line of ink, and though others tried to strike that line, in the end it remained. That is more than most of us can claim. He rose then, slowly, and moved to the desk. From the lower drawer, he retrieved the case file, a slim envelope marked simply Westerly. He opened it, removed the folded note Miss Bell had once sent, and read it again in silence. Then, with a small motion of finality, he placed it back inside and resealed the envelope. I watched as he crossed to the hearth and slid the file, not into the fire, but into the drawer beside the mantel where he kept a few precious things, tokens from cases that had changed him more than he admitted. The goose quill from the Adler affair, a bullet casing from the Boscombe Valley, now a name that had once been lost and returned. He closed the drawer with care. "There," he said softly, "let him rest." And that was all. We resumed our morning then, as if the world had not just settled into a finer balance, but something had shifted, and I, who had followed Holmes through 100 unravelings and 1,000 deductions, knew it had nothing to do with crime or evidence or scandal. It was, in the end, about a man who had vanished, a woman who had remembered, and a detective who for once did not bring the world to justice, only made space for its grief. The case of the stolen name in the will was never published in any periodical. It appeared only in my private notebooks, under a heading Holmes never saw, a heading I added with my own hand. Long after the case was closed, the name that would not die, the name that would